So I will say, in being approached by Kevin, who, I feel like we go way back, even though I guess maybe it really only has been maybe like 4 years or so. I don't know, maybe something like that. 4 or 5 years. I did have to ask, what is accompaniment? What is that? Because of course, I think in my field, that's like someone playing the piano in a corner of a room while you audition. And so I was very grateful, not only for that, but also, Kevin shared with me Robert Schreiter's book, which unsurprisingly I had not read yet, but reading the chapter on the John's Gospel was so informative to this idea, as you can see projected here, of artistic meteorology. That is something that is not something that exists, it's just something I made up, so now it exists. But it's this idea, which I'll get into, but just this idea about what it means to create weather. I'm very fortunate to be married to a middle school English teacher here in Chicago Public Schools District, and she talks a lot about that as an educator as well. And maybe this is something that you all can relate to in whatever ministries you're involved in, this idea of creating weather. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But as a way of additional introduction, so yes, my work is as a playwright and educator. I also sometimes say a recovering actor. And I think in all of those different hats that I wear is the idea of storytelling. And the idea of storytelling has, I think, a lot of parallels with a ministry of reconciliation. But there was a time, I guess about 12 years ago or so, where I was living in Austin, Texas, where I'm from, and I was, feeling stuck. I wasn't really sure what to do with myself as a writer, as an actor, or as a creator, as a human. What I eventually found is that I needed a change of environment, and hence why I'm here in Chicago. But I took some time to craft a personal mission statement. Obviously it was one of those things that I knew very well that theaters have and companies have, and I figured, well, if it works for them, maybe it'll work for me. And so here I have my mission to awaken the hungry human spirits of those in need of artistic contact with courage and empathy. And when I think about the word courage, I think about sort of the root of that word, the idea of telling your whole story with your whole heart. And so storytelling is very much a part of that mission for me. So this idea of theater as a ministry of reconciliation, I think, really popped out to me in diving into the work of Robert Schreiter in this book. Hence why I had to remember how to cite something in MLA format. It's been a long time. And thank goodness there are generators online that can do that for you. Let's say again?
I said, thank goodness your wife is an English.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yes, I didn't ask her. I was kind, and I said, I'm not going to ask you how to do this, but she probably would have been very kind to tell me. But, this idea of in the gospel, it's weird to even say that, in the gospel. I will say I'm not a preacher, but I have been confused for a preacher multiple times in my life. Literally, I think, there was a time someone came out to me and was just like, hey, don't you preach at such and such church? And I was like, no. And then when it happened a second time, I was like, okay, I got to examine some things. So I think about these 4 steps in the ministry of reconciliation that are mentioned, in this book and in that chapter. The idea of accompaniment, of course, the reason for the season, why we're all here. Hospitality, connection, and commissioning. And I'll just say the second point, the idea that accompaniment and hospitality are sort of, man-made things that can be achieved through human endeavor, and then connection and commissioning being these elements that are divine. I was really struck by that. Because I think that there are, certainly a lot of parallels in what I do as a playwright and as a theater maker in that regard. And I was really struck by the idea that, communities of reconciliation are ones of safety, memory, and hope. And I was thinking about what we often say as theaters that we want to do. We are very much interested in cultivating new audiences. I don't know if you've heard, but oh goodness. But that the American theater is often, said to be dying. But we often say, but it's you haven't killed us yet, and I think that's important. But I do think that theaters are very concerned with what it means to ensure our long-term viability. I think especially when we're competing with so many other factors. I think that's the number one question that we have. I just went to a theater conference last week, and that is some of the concern. There were 2 sessions, which I skipped, about AI. I probably shouldn't have skipped them. But that is of utmost concern, I think, for us as creative individuals, but also I think, Flora, I'm resonating what you were saying about, these are spaces, or these spaces that we're seeking online, in social media, in chat bots, et cetera, where, we are looking for accompaniment. And what does it mean to find genuine, authentic accompaniment in this art form of theater that has been around for, thousands of years. So in thinking about those different elements of accompaniment, that idea of listening, trying to understand your audience, hospitality, of course, I think we think of theater lobbies and concessions and comfortable seats sometimes. Most of the time, they're quite the opposite. But creating this welcoming experience, and this experience where you feel that you can receive the art in the best possible way. And then, yes, this idea of connection. Of course, you're experiencing theater live in the moment, being created with you in the room. You're connecting with other audience members as well. And then this idea of commissioning, this idea of there is then an ask of you in some way. Certainly it's very much a tacit ask. It's not explicit sometimes what the ask is, although sometimes you'll have a playbill that'll tell you, note from the director, like, this is what I think you should take away. So there's a lot of debate on the use of those director's notes or playwright notes. But yes, we often think about what it means to create these safe spaces where we can explore memories and hopefully leave with a sense of hope at the end of it. So this idea of weather and artistic meteorology is interesting to me, because I think it gets into the really murky and sort of not easily tangible parts of being an artist, which I think Karina illustrated so well, is that there is so much of it that is divine, that is out of your hands, that is inspired. And so you are often tasked with taking these really large ideas or concepts or traumas or tragedies and distilling them into something that you can hold or perceive. Which is sometimes really hard to do, but this idea of weather and the idea of playwrights controlling the weather, like I said, this was inspired by my wife, middle school English teacher. Pray for her. She talks about that, about in her classroom. That she controls that weather, that if it's going to be a good day or a sunny day, a stormy day, that often it falls on her. And I really resonated with that, not only as a playwright, but also as an administrator, somebody who leads a group of people, that it is often this idea of weather is important. It's atmosphere, it's vibe, but it also is it requires a humility to sort of say that I'm not in control, but what I can do is create an experience that then other people can have, their own revelations or discoveries through. So when I think about that work as a playwright in particular, it's interesting because we are tasked with writing down, chronicling the times, as they say. And I often am asked, like, where do I get my inspiration from? And, certainly it's just what feels right to me, what feels like it wants to be a play. Not everything needs to be a play. But what feels like it wants to emerge in that form. But then the other really important part of that is what is interesting to me. What is it that I want to explore? And, if you're going to spend, the amount of time that it takes to write a play and that you spend with a play it's so long. It is so long. I'll say that, there's a play that I wrote called St. Miles, which we'll talk more about in this presentation, that I started writing, informally in 2020. And it's going to have its world premiere next season, so either in 2026 or 2027. Thank you very much. But that's a long amount of time, 6 or 7 years, depending on when it'll emerge. And I've been working on it that entire time in various different ways. And so what I always say to my students, if I'm teaching playwriting, and I typically teach playwriting to young folks or folks who are non-professional, is to say that you must pick something that you are willing to spend a lot of time with, because you will spend potentially a really good portion of your life on a single play, because even when a play is presented and maybe even published, you can still work on it. There's no rule that says I can't go into my Google Docs and make an edit. And that's the joy of theater, is that it is this alive thing. So one production of a play is going to be very different from a production of the same play in a different city, et cetera, with different actors in a different time. So hence is why revivals exist, because clearly there's a play that needs to be revisited for some reason because we have changed. And though we're saying the same words and doing largely the same actions that the play asks of us, it's going to have new resonance. So that idea of forecasting, the idea of saying, let me listen, let me observe, but that listening and observation is also of yourself. Let me listen to myself, let me observe myself. What is it that I'm forecasting in my own soul as well? It's interesting to think about this part of the meteorology metaphor in terms of hospitality in the Ministry of Reconciliation, because certainly, as I mentioned, theaters, they have the nice, lighting, they've got the nice, seats, et cetera. But as a playwright, I don't have to be nice. And in fact, I am sort of the person then that is in charge of creating, again, the weather of that room. Once the lights go down and the play begins, folks may be subjected to some very traumatic things, some very harsh things, some lovely things, some jokes, some laughs, but your reactions may vary, and hopefully they do, which is why the idea of weather is so interesting, because my goal is always to create a space where things can, be alive. And so if one person has a reaction and the person next to them has the opposite reaction, that's great. That is a sign of success in many ways. So I think about that, and I think about how this final, portion of the Ministry of Reconciliation of the commission, this idea that we embed calls to action in our plays, and largely, technique-wise, that's through theme, I would say. The idea of, what is this message that we're trying to convey in our work? Hopefully that's done skillfully so that, it's not so obvious or it doesn't beat you over the head, et cetera. But we do ask ourselves sometimes, what should my play compel someone to do in order to keep it active? And that's something that we should ask ourselves as playwrights throughout the writing process. Certainly, once we get in the room with a director, that's a good thing to consider. because there really are sort of two parts of this process. There's a part that's like me in my bedroom with this very computer here, typing away. That's a very lonely part of the process. It can be. But then there is a part of the process where we start to put a play on its feet, where we start to produce the play. And that's exciting because then there's so many other people that join the party. And that idea of creating weather, of creating accompaniment, shifts in that regard too. So I do often think about that. What should my play compel someone to do? Once you see my play, what do you do next? For a lot of folks, you go out and maybe get a drink, you talk about it, and my hope is that people engage in debate over what I've written. So I have this case study. We're going to talk about my play St. Miles, which I wrote, and just a little background on how this play came to be. So I was working at an organization called Silk Road Rising as a teaching artist, and that organization contracted with CTU to present some classes that I taught. So that's how I kind of came over here. While I was here, I was like, I was under commission at the Goodman to write a play, which became this play. And it was all about canonization. And I was like, okay, well, let me ask these folks that I've gotten to know through this class, about what canonization is. And that's sort of how I ended up doing a reading of St. Miles here. And sort of what brings me here to get a chance to talk a little more deeply about the process and how it relates to the idea of accompaniment. So this is the description of the play. So 5 years ago, the Ellis family lost one of its members, a young black man named Miles, to an act of police violence. Now Miles's mother, Opal, wants him to be recognized as a saint. As the Ellises navigate the arduous canonization process, the family clashes and battle lines are drawn. Is true salvation on the other side of it all? There are 10,000 saints in the Catholic Church. Not one of them is African American yet. So this idea, again, thinking about the accompaniment aspect of being a playwright, came about in 2020. So I was listening and walking alongside my friends, myself, at what was going down that year. And I had this idea of like, there's all this mobilization happening over the death of people who look like me. And I had this random thought one day of just like, well, what if we come to find out that George Floyd is a saint? I'm seeing so much mobilization in a way that we've never seen, to that degree, and certainly not in my lifetime. So I kept getting stuck on this idea of like, what if George Floyd was a saint? Karina and I talked a little bit yesterday about how ideas work, where oftentimes ideas just sort of float around in the atmosphere, and they come to you and they ask, "Are you going to bring me forth?" And if you wait too long, it may hop to somebody else. And that's why, as artists, sometimes we notice that someone else has, created the thing that we, thought we were going to make, which can be really frustrating. But it's like, potentially you waited too long to bring it forth. So I was like, I want to try to make this happen. I sketched out a few scenes, but ultimately it was too hard. I don't think it was the right time. I was very nervous to write this play because, of course, I knew it would involve a really big lift. I had written, really one other play at that time, the War of the Worlds adaptation that Kevin mentioned in my bio. And so it was a really big lift, but so I put it aside. I wrote a whole other play, and then this commission came around from the Goodman Theater here in Chicago, and they do a program called New Stages, where they commission 4 local playwrights to write a play over a whole season. And so you get resources, you're meeting, twice a month, you're sharing, pages that you've written, you get a midpoint reading in the middle of the residency where, actors come in and read your work. You get a reading at the end where actors come in and read your work, and you get a director at that point. And then there's always the option that the Goodman would further develop your play or even produce it. Still waiting on that, Goodman. But that was an interesting opportunity for me to say, okay, I don't have to do this alone. I have the Goodman, I have, their resources. I have, 3 other playwrights in this cohort. One of which, I will say, shout out to Dylan Chitto, who mentioned to me in the process of kind of talking to him about this play, that he has been a student at CTU before. And it was great to know that I could rely on these folks to walk with me, through this play, and I through the process of writing theirs. So that's where it started. That's sort of the accompaniment portion of things. And then moving into the idea of hospitality, this notion that I then have to go and see, like, what do I want this play to be? How do I want it to feel? What am I trying to accomplish and to achieve? Each play kind of has its own mission statement in a way. And I knew that this one wanted to, be an authentic portrayal, which I then knew that I needed to, create something that was not going to be easy to digest, or easy to swallow. I think about, there's this passage, actually, I think it's on page 85 here, that is mentioned, that Robert Schreiter mentions. He talks about the experience of many victims of violence. The quotidian experience of life seems disrupted forever. Words they hear, things they see, people they encounter can bring back immediately the trauma that they have experienced. It is as though the past is never really behind them, but is lurking alongside them, waiting to spring out in front of them at every turn. And it made me think about, like, oh, that's like a horror movie, right? That's like a haunted house, It's very similar, or like a roller coaster. These are these things that we create, these works of art, where you have this safe space, the safe container to explore really difficult content. So, people go to haunted houses because, they know they're going to step out on the other side, of the house, but they know that within that time, they're going to explore what it means to be terrified in this ultimately safe way. But it's gonna, bring up some things. Horror movies as well, movies in general, but there are this opportunity, as are plays, of course, to be exposed to difficult content, things that you may have a lot of experience with. St. Miles is a play very much about grief and very much about unprocessed, unfaced grief, where this family is essentially exploring canonization as a way to sidestep the grieving process, as a way for them to not face the fact that this member of their family was killed in this very public way. And there's unimaginable trauma associated with that. So in doing that, there are moments that are very funny in that play, and then, in fact, I just did a reading of the play in Texas, in Dallas, and that cast was completely different from the cast of actors that I had in Chicago, and they really leaned into the humor in this really beautiful way, and so the play was very funny. But they often say, those moments that are funny as writers are the perfect moment to, like, your audience is at their most vulnerable when they're laughing. So it is this very perfect moment to throw in something unexpected. And so, again, thinking about weather, thinking about the way that the weather evolves. So I dug into that process of writing the play that way. And then thinking about connection, that's a really interesting part of the ministry of reconciliation as it relates to theater. again, it's those last two that are the ones that are a bit out of our control as theater makers, where people are going to make their own connections, right? They're gonna see this play, not only the audiences, but also the designers and the actors and the director. They're all gonna look at this document and they're gonna have their interpretations. This is very much like the Bible or any sacred text where, there are these different interpretations. And I've been just like so jazzed, like hearing folks, quote these passages, from the Bible and, the way that, oh, Jesus did this, or he said this, and like, what does that mean? Or like, this word comes up here and then it doesn't come up until here. What does that mean? I mean, I'm like, whoa, that's like any close reading of like a book or anything else, and I love that. I often say to my students too that when you're writing a play, you're really just writing a recipe, and someone else is going to have to cook it. And what is my duty to give them just enough information so that there's room for their touch, for their seasoning, if you will. Because I could certainly go in and describe exactly how the set should look. It's like, okay, like this wall is this many feet, and the lights should dim right on this line, or the sound should sound just like this. But that to me is not interesting. And I will say plays have evolved to a point where like the stage directions really take a different form, and that level of specificity is not as interesting. So I am kind of creating an atmosphere for designers and actors to do their best work. But then the play itself becomes this, occasion for audiences to come through, make their own connections, and connect with each other. What I love, this was an unexpected joy about going from being an actor to a playwright. What I love is this idea of like, I write a play and it's performed in some other city, and the audience comes, night after night, while I'm like, I don't know, chilling on the couch. My play is happening in Dallas or something. And there's all this activity happening. There are people who get a chance to meet. Maybe two people, just like Barack and Michelle met at a screening of Do the Right Thing. It's like maybe like these really cool people meet at my play and then they start a family. But like my play was the thing that, brought them together. I've been overjoyed to see, actors that have been in my plays get further work because someone saw them in that play and then wanted to cast them in this thing or that thing. So this idea of getting to create space for that to happen is so satisfying. And then finally, there is this call to action. There's this thing that we say, okay, like what are you being commissioned to do by seeing this play? What should you do? And in the case of, St. Miles, I think about, what does it mean to explore grief in this way, and to come on the other side of it, changed, hopefully for the better. I tend to write endings that do ask that question. I often say, like, if you're trying to find what the theme of a movie, book, play, story is, what is the last thing that the writer decided to show you? What is that last image? And in many ways, that's gonna be a clue. I always use the metaphor, again, because I teach kids, I always use the metaphor of The Lion King. The Lion King ends the same way that it began, right? In a circle of life, right? So it's no surprise then that that's in some ways what we're left with, in that piece. And so I think a lot about that and how that call to action can be embedded there at the end. And it's not lost on me, that this idea of the commission being that call to action in this sort of, ministry of reconciliation, that's also what we say when we're commissioned to create a work of art, right? Whether, it's visual art or a play, et cetera, you're commissioned to do it. So it's not lost on me, this idea that the creative process begins and ends with this word commission, with this action that needs to be taken. So I think a lot about that, and it was great to explore that through this play. But that's a little bit of the life cycle of how that ministry sort of shows up on the playwright level. Robert Schreiter also mentions the idea of ritual in this chapter too, and I think about, of course, that theater is a ritual. I think we wouldn't argue with that in any way. It's one of our oldest rituals in many ways. And he mentions the idea that rituals endure, that they remind us who we are. They offer this guidebook on how we can change our future and sort of find closure. And the best rituals are able to do that. And then I'm also thinking about education and engagement work, which are aspects of a theater that are really public-facing in this sort of dynamic way. So obviously, theaters face the public in that they invite folks in to see their plays, but then there are these two departments, education and engagement. Sometimes they're combined into one, where you are getting to interact with the public in these highly sort of specific ways. So, I am the director of education at Court Theater down the street. Court Theater is the Center for Classic Theater at the University of Chicago. It's not the theater department, but it is a professional Tony Award-winning theater on that campus that is meant to be a resource, for the students and the faculty. The way that having an art museum on campus that doesn't show student work necessarily is a resource. And I think a lot about this idea of theater as a resource, the same way that a church is a community resource, or a grocery store, or a library. And I think about what are those things that people come specifically to a theater for. And in many ways it's entertainment, of course, but obviously there's always something deeper. And I think about how education and engagement work are these institutional opportunities to accompany. So there are these ways that we say, okay, we as a theater want to listen deeply. We know that if that is our ministry, then accompaniment is that first step. And so given that we in the education department or the engagement department are dealing with the public directly, how do we present what we do to the public, and how do we listen to the public and bring it back into our work to enrich and enliven the work and make it specific to the community that we're in. In the case of Court, our community is the South Side of Chicago. So in my role as director of education, my teaching artists work in 5 South Side high schools, very close to our footprint at the university. We do a 2-pronged approach where in the fall, students are learning about literature of the Black diaspora, and in the spring, we have what's called a story lab, which is where students center their voices and create monologues or plays that are their own voice, kind of based on the things that they learned in the fall. In the engagement side of things, that's sort of the non, young people related side of things. So we're doing lectures, we're doing archival digs, we're doing book clubs, partnering with the Chicago Public Libraries, other entities, and they're all sort of based on something that we're doing on our main stage. So for example, we're doing a play, a musical called Out Here, which is a show about a woman who comes out of the closet later in life and is sort of navigating the family that she had, her ex-husband and child, and this new sort of understanding of her sexuality, and trying to sort of balance those two worlds, and a musical, which is really cool. And so one of the things that we're doing is we were doing book clubs about queerness in Chicago, and specifically having lecturers come through and talk about their understanding of that theme, that idea. So it's really exciting to get to, again, accompany in this new novel way. So I love that aspect of theater. And I wanted to sort of share this quote. This is a quote from Laszlo Krasznahorkai. Yes, I did the work to pronounce that for you. Laszlo Krasznahorkai. If you've seen that name before, he is the current Nobel Prize winner for literature. And he wrote this book called Spadework for a Palace that I read. It is one long 80-page sentence. And he has this quote that just really stuck out to me, which is art is a cloud that provides shade from the sweltering heat, or a flash of lightning that splits the sky, where in that shade shelter or that lightning's flash, the world simply becomes not the same as before. Which I think is interesting because I like the way that that ends. It says the world simply becomes not the same as before. It's kind of vague, you know? It doesn't really provide specifics, but it also says that it's simple. You know, it simply becomes not the same as before. I had an acting teacher say to me, simplicity is no simple thing. And that is, I live by that. It is so true that often the work that we do as creators is invisible work. You know, that same acting teacher also said that acting is the most deceptive of art forms because at its best, it is invisible. Meaning that if you can tell that someone is acting, it's probably not good acting, right? It's probably bad. But that's, I think the same can be said for educators, and I'm sure for clergy as well. It takes tremendous work to be able to do something that feels natural. I've known that for a long time as an actor, and as a writer, it's really satisfying to find ways to do what feels very invisible, which is to step aside and to say, I've created this thing, I'm just gonna leave that there and let whatever is gonna happen, happen. But it means you have to create some weather. You have to create a cloud. So I think a lot about that in my work and what my responsibility is to create a cloud, essentially.